Stardew Valley is a special game for a number of reasons, but while playing it the other day I had a moment of clarity, one of those real oh fuck moments. Between the periodic land tilling, crop tending, tree felling, fruit foraging and chicken husbandry, I found myself aping my own real world behaviour. Since player projection has been a thing in games for decades, on the surface this is nothing new. In the case of Stardew Valley, this kind of thing is built into its freeform framework. It's about what you want to do. You are rewarded for the steps you take, regardless of the direction, and there are no fail states to act as a barrier to enjoyment. You can chase perfection, becoming an agricultural aficionado, a mine-delving monster hunter, a cod-catching connoisseur, expanding your arable empire and raking in more gold than the GDP of small countries. Or you can choose to be content with living the good life, making just enough to keep yourself comfortable, and maybe settling down with a special someone by your side. You can have it all, or have enough, and it is entirely up to you. Only this is not what I'm talking about when I say behaviour. These are actions, system-driven strings on a vast web of choice that point players down pathways where the destination is always progress. When I talk about behaviour, what I am talking about is more the bits in between, those aspects that don't necessarily have an empirical value, but retain a certain compelling draw, and in my case, transition what would classically be deemed gameplay loops into something disarmingly authentic and, dare I say, human. Core gameplay loop is an important piece of terminology in game criticism. It describes not only what the game is all about, but what you'll specifically be doing for the bulk of its experience. While games are often lauded for the small details, and sometimes a bad loop can be forgiven if it offers something of value more abstract, for the most part it's quite important to get that loop right. It's the bread and butter of keeping your audience playing. Games like Stardew Valley are all about core gameplay loops. Each in-game day you awake, fresh-faced, full of vim and vigour, eager to set out to work the land, tend your livestock, dredge the ocean and maybe spend a few precious moments flirting with your boo. And indeed, this has been my experience with the game. I have my modest patch of tilled land now bursting with vegetation, a small hut with some chickens, always pleased to see me. A battalion of mayonnaise machines stood by stoically, waiting for that eggy goodness. I've just bought a cow. Called it Moolah. No, I will not apologise. The days go by, I water my plants, tend to my feathered friends, and then pop into town to visit the local store. I don't buy anything, especially now I have renewable crops and therefore less need for seed, but it's nice to have a look. Did you spot the odd one out in that description? It's nice to have a look. Something innocuous, that has nothing to do with the systems in a fairly systems-heavy game. There's no benefit to visiting the store without purchase. You don't rack up friendship points or get access to new wares the more you visit, so why do it? Because it's what I do in the real world. Almost every day after work I run a sort of relief lap around the city centre, tempering my retail woes by paying tribute to the spectres of capitalism on the other side, almost never pulling a single coin from my comically sparse purse. I like to look at things. I like that sense of comfort that comes from walking into a familiar space with a wealth of goodies on display. Stuff you don't need, but it is still a relief to know that it's there, in case one day you change your mind. If, like me, you suffer from depression or anxiety, you probably understand why this kind of behaviour is important. The circuit, these routine behavioural patterns that become coping mechanisms for the everyday struggle of the self. It's not about sticking to a comfort zone, it's about allaying those worst pathological fears about one's worth. To me, at least, it is as valuable a form of self-care as medication or therapy. So in playing Stardew Valley, I've unconsciously been seeking to emulate the things in my life that bring me comfort. Through this frame, The game becomes less about loops and more about routines. Still cyclical and still functioning around the game's systems, but with this additional authentic oomph that comes from me projecting onto my avatar. There's a downside to this too, however, because although I've brought these coping mechanisms into the game, I've also brought aspects of my psyche that hinder the goals I've chosen to pursue. Rain is a good example of this. A blessing in disguise, rainy days in Stardew Valley mean precious hours saved. Energy that can be used for other things like fishing or getting deeper into the mines or stockpiling wood and stone, because my word, do you need a lot of wood and stone. But rain is also an oppressive element. Its omnipresence intimidates, both visually and audibly. You are rarely able to get away from it, and unlike weather in the real world, it won't stop until the day's end. The psychological impact of this for me personally is that on those days when the heavens open, I am hesitant to do more than the bare minimum, even though it would be more prudent to maximise non-farming related activities. I just don't feel like it, so I don't do it. This kind of experience isn't exclusive to Stardew Valley, but it arguably works so well here because of the game's structure and, in particular, how often it steps aside. Mental health isn't in the game. It isn't an aspect of the user interface, a cheap means of throwing an obstacle in the player's way. There is nothing in Stardew Valley's design or execution that even lightly insinuates this. Yet, in my time with the game, its presence could be felt everywhere. Felt in the exasperation at how quickly time seems to fly by when you're performing even the most basic of tasks. Felt in the limited and often isolating interactions you have with the town's residents, who are perfectly pleasant, but you never quite get the feeling that they really know who you are. Felt in the deafening silence that sometimes wraps itself around you, and those occasionally mournful autumnal ballads that signal the ever-moving passage of time. But also felt in the welcome plink as your coffers fill after a successful harvest. In the knowledge that while the end goal might be a long way away, regression is even further. In the feeling of safety that comes from the spit and crackle of your hearth upon returning home after a hard day's toil, your faithful hound curled up beside you as you rest up for another day. More than just an exploration of life in a small rural community, Stardew Valley inadvertently created a simulacrum of the act of living itself. To this end, it excels, not because it is realistic, but because it doesn't try to be. In place of dozens of complex systems, interactions that make every waking second a deranged seesaw between base survival instincts and creeping ennui, it chose an almost blank slate, a canvas on which the player can project, and in turn reflect on what makes their life theirs, and theirs alone.